Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks to the panel for being here. We wish that there were other members, of course. Mr. Duran, in your testimony, you discuss the need to restore checks and balances, and note that while Mr. Rhodes' behavior is scandalous, and I think propaganda is a word that you used, it wasn't a rogue operation, but that he was carrying out the will of the President. Questions that I'm sure my constituents, representing them here in the People's House, would want me to ask in reference to this is, number one, how can Congress take steps to prevent this President and future Presidents from circumventing Congress?
I think this is a part of the inherent tension in our government. I did say that I think that Mr. Rhodes is doing the bidding of the President. I think it's important to remember that. We have now numerous accounts mainly from former defense secretaries, Panetta and Gates especially, showing how there's an inner core in the White House of 5 or 6 people who consult closely with the President about his views, and everybody else is pretty much left out of the conversation, that, including principals of the on the National Security Council. And Mr. Rhodes is part of that inner circle. The only answer I have to this, I spent a lot of time thinking about it. The only answer I have are the two that I gave you. One is just exercising the oversight responsibilities that Congress has, asking the hard questions, and continually putting pressure on the executive branch to come clean. The second is, I think, cutting back the size of the NSC. It's simply wrong. I think anyone on both sides of the aisle would see that the National Security Council, created by statute in 1947, was created to be a coordinating body, not an operational arm of the government. And under President Obama, it has slipped into becoming an operational arm. And I think when you look at the war room, as described not by me, but by Mr. Rhodes, this is an operational White House. Just one last point here. There's an issue here that I think we all just need to be aware of, but there's not much we can do about it, and that is the collapse of the press. So one of the reasons why this is a threat to our checks and balances is because of the collapse of, I would say, certain informal checks on governmental power that have disappeared over the last decade, very, very quickly because of the rise of the rise of the Internet. What Ben Rhodes said in that article about foreign events being reported from Washington and from the White House by young reporters who don't know anything and don't have any other sources of information except what the White House is telling them, is completely correct, and it's a danger. There's nothing much in terms of legislation that we can do about that, but we need to be aware of it. It's sort of a double danger, because not only do those reporters not have alternative sources of information, but because all of the information is coming out of the White House, they have a special interest in maintaining good relations to the White House and reporting the news stories as the White House wants them reported.
Let me go on from that as well, and Mr. Rubin, you may want to jump in here as well. Ben Rhodes' assistant, in the article, in his report, his comments in the New York Times Magazine article, indicated that there were compadres involved in this, and some of those were in the think tank community as well. Who would he be referring to in the think tank and policy world?
The Plowshares Fund.
The what?
The Plowshares Fund has funded many of the elements of the so-called echo chamber, to use Ben Rhodes' words. Supposedly neutral assessors, for example, in various arms control think tanks, perhaps in the Atlantic Council as well, and elsewhere, were receiving grants. Now, one can say, just because one has received a grant from this high-level funder, and by the way, this funder also had provided grants to senior Iranian officials working in the United States as well, at universities and so forth. Just because they have funded doesn't necessarily mean that there's a quid pro quo, but what you will find is that anyone who has received Plowshares funding, especially for the bulk of their grant or the bulk of their salary, never not once contradicted the assessment which Ben Rhodes sought to put forward.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Now recognize the gentlewoman from New York, Ms. Maloney, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. After a good deal of deliberation,